Hello students, in this session I will be discussing about the types of respiration. The respiration is broadly classified into two types, that is aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. So before explaining this, I would like to explain and recall how does the respiration takes place generally in our body. Okay, so there are 4 steps under this respiration. So let us recall the steps which are involved in the respiration. The first step is breathing. Second, exchange of oxygen between the lungs and the blood. The third step is exchange of oxygen between the blood and organ. And the final step is cellular respiration. Okay. So these are the 4 major steps involved under the respiration. So now, what happens under breathing? So when we breathe in oxygen, that is when we breathe in, what is entered? The oxygen is entered inside. Right? So this oxygen reaches the lungs now. So whatever the oxygen which entered inside, it reaches the lungs. So as the oxygen reaches the lungs take in oxygen and it gives out the carbon dioxide. Hope you know this, right? So now the oxygen from the lungs, it goes to blood. Okay, so you all know that the blood in our body flows to every part, right? So it travels upwards, downwards, everywhere. Every part of our body is consisting of blood. So during this process, what happens is the oxygen present in the blood. Now what happened was from the lungs, the oxygen entered to the blood. Right? So now what happens is the oxygen present in the blood, it reaches to the different organs. Okay. The oxygen from the blood reaches to different organs. And now tell me students, what is present inside the organ? What is organ made up of? I'll tell you, right? So finally from the organ it reaches to cells. What is organ made up of? I'll tell you. So you can observe this picture. Hope you all know this is the complete organ system where inside the human there is presence of various organ. When we look into each organ, the organ is made up of tissues. What it is made up of? It is made up of tissues. And what are tissues made up of? They are made up of cells. Right? So many cells. They together form tissues. And these tissues together form the organ. This you have already studied in your 9th standard. Right? So now you understood what is present inside the organ. So now what happens is inside the cells, right? Inside the cell receives the oxygen, right? And this cell, after receiving the oxygen, so this is a proper view of the cell. So as the cell receives the oxygen, what happens? It enters to cytoplasm. And what is present inside a cell? There are so many cell organelles. And this oxygen now finally reaches to mitochondria. Why it is reaching to mitochondria and all, I'll explain you in detail again. Right? What happens now inside a mitochondria is cellular respiration takes place. Inside the mitochondria, cellular respiration takes place. So whatever I have discussed with you now, once again quickly I'll tell you. Right? So what we saw in the first step? In the first step we saw that breathing took place. So in the first step what we saw was breathing took place, right? So as a result of breathing, what happened? The oxygen enters. The oxygen entered to the lungs. So what happened now? So exchange of gases took place. Right? Now from nostril it enters to lungs. Now from the lungs, where does it go? The oxygen was exchanged between lungs and blood. Right? Now the oxygen present in the blood enters from blood to organ, right? Now from the organ it reaches to cells, where cells is the place where cellular respiration takes place. Inside the cells there is presence of cell organelles. So where does this cellular respiration takes place? It takes place inside the mitochondria. So as a result of this, what happened? As a result of cellular respiration, the energy is released. Okay, hope you all understood. I said you briefly now. So this mechanism of respiration is very important. What happens under the steps of respiration? Okay, so now let us understand what happens under the respiration. Fine. So what happens is the digested food which was already present in the blood. So how does it enter to blood? You all know, right? The food get digested inside the small intestine, right? So as it get digested inside the small intestine, it will become into simple absorbable form, and it has been absorbed by the blood, right? The villi are, they are considered as the finger-like projections which are present on the wall of the small intestine. They are highly or richly supplied with the blood vessels, and these villi, they absorb the food into the blood. Now where is food present? Food is present inside the blood. Okay, so one thing you remember, children, in this session I will be considering food as glucose. Why glucose? You know that glucose is released under the process of digestion. Now the food is present inside the blood, right? Now the food which is present, where is food and what is food? I told you glucose, right? So the glucose is present inside the blood or in the blood, and the oxygen which we took inside. How do we take in oxygen? You know, right? So now the oxygen took is also present inside or in the blood. Okay. So now what happened is the blood carries inhaled oxygen and the digested food, that is glucose. Okay. So both now the oxygen and glucose reach to the cells. I have showed you the image of cell, right? So both the oxygen plus the food, that is the glucose, it reached to the cell. Hope you understood, right? So as the oxygen and food now enters to the cell, what happens? Cellular respiration takes place. What takes place? The cellular respiration takes place inside the cells. So as a result of this cellular respiration, the energy is released. I told you where it is released. It is released in the mitochondria, from the mitochondria, right? So the energy is released. So along with the energy, the carbon dioxide and water is also released as the byproduct. So what are the things released under cellular respiration? How does cellular respiration took place? So for cellular respiration, the oxygen and glucose, they both are the raw materials, right? So this oxygen and glucose enters to the cell. Inside a cell there is cytoplasm, and through the cytoplasm it reaches the mitochondria, where the cellular respiration takes place. So as a result of cellular respiration, carbon dioxide, water and energy is released as a byproduct. So please remember this mechanism. It may be little bit confusion or difficult at the beginning, but if you hear 2 to 3 times, it will be very easy topic, right? Let us move forward now. As I was discussing, the respiration was broadly classified into 2 types, that is aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration, right? Then what is meant by aerobic respiration? It is a respiration which takes place in the presence of oxygen. What is meant by aerobic respiration? The respiration which takes place in the presence of oxygen. What is meant by anaerobic respiration? The respiration which takes place in the absence of oxygen, we call it as anaerobic respiration. Okay. Now, let us see what happens first under aerobic respiration. Okay. So now, under aerobic respiration, what happens is when the human being takes in food, what happens to that food? The food get digested. I'll be recalling these topics again and again, right? So as the human being takes in food, what happens? The food get digested. Remember what happens under the process of digestion? What happens under the process of digestion? The food get completely digested, right? I mean the complex food became simpler ones. And once this complete digestion takes place, what happens? The digested food enters to the blood, right? So the digested food now got entered to the blood. That is, I was telling you, food. It will be the simple food particles, right? So what happens now for the food? The food get absorbed by the blood, and the blood is being carried to different parts of the body. Why? Because each cells in our body, it requires some amount of food. Why they require food? Because to produce the energy, right? So as the food reaches to the mitochondria, as I told you, the mitochondria uses the food, that is the glucose, from the blood, and it releases the energy. Now the question is, what is the energy? What is the energy which is released here called as? As I told you, the mitochondria releases energy, right? So this energy is called as ATP. So what is ATP? ATP is adenosine triphosphate, right? So the energy released under this process will be in the form of ATP molecules. ATP molecules. So ATP molecules is also called as the energy currencies of the cell. So under cellular respiration, as I already told you, along with the ATP, what else is released? As a byproduct, carbon dioxide and water is also released. Okay, hope you understood what happens in respiration. The first three steps which I have discussed earlier was, first the step was the breathing, and the second, as oxygen enters into the lungs, what happened? There will be exchange of gases between the lungs and the blood, which took place in second step. And in the third step, there was exchange of gases between the lungs and organs, right? Then in the organs there is presence of tissues and cells. And what is happening in the cells? When the food reaches the cells, it enters into the cytoplasm. I have already told you, right? The food enters to the cytoplasm and it goes inside the cytoplasm and reaches the cell organelle, right? So as the food enters to the cytoplasm, the food gets broken down. You should remember, because I told you under the respiration. What is meant by respiration? Respiration is a process of breaking down of food. The purpose is to release the energy, right? As the food enters to the cytoplasm, the food gets broken down. Okay? As the food is broken down, the pyruvate is formed. What is meant by pyruvate? What is meant by food first? I told you the food is the glucose. So this glucose is broken down to form the pyruvate. Then what is the difference between glucose and pyruvate? The glucose contains 6 molecules of carbon, whereas once the glucose get divided, it forms 3 molecules of carbon, which is called as pyruvate. Okay, did you understand? Okay, now let us move towards an important topic. What happens in the human beings? So let us understand in human beings what happens in the human beings under cellular respiration. Okay, already I told you the food is present inside the blood. That is, the glucose is present inside the blood. When it is present, once the complete digestion takes place, the food enters to the blood. So the food is the glucose. The food is considered as glucose now. So now what happened? This glucose molecule is divided into 3 atoms of carbon. I told you, that is pyruvate. Pyruvate contains 3 molecules of carbon plus energy which is being released. Right? So what happens here is, in human beings, the cellular respiration takes place in mitochondria. Now I will be explaining you only this part. First, I'll be explaining you only this part. Okay, so what happens as the glucose enters to the cell, it goes to the cytoplasm. Later, it is further broken down into 3 carbon molecules. What happens then in the presence of oxygen? In mitochondria. Okay, I am talking about the human beings or any living organism. Okay, so in the presence of oxygen in mitochondria, what happened? Carbon dioxide is released. Means the 6 carbon molecule, as it entered to the cytoplasm, it is divided into 3 carbon molecule. Right? So this 3 carbon is further broken down to form carbon dioxide. Here only the single carbon atom is present. Okay, so under this pathway, what happened? So in the presence of oxygen in the mitochondria, the byproducts released are carbon dioxide, water and energy. So what is happening here? One more thing you have to understand. Here the complete oxidation is taking place and the energy is released in mitochondria. Once again I'll explain. You may feel difficult, right? But it is very easy once you understand, right? Okay, so as I told you, the glucose present in the blood enters in cytoplasm, that is very cytoplasm inside the cell, right? So the glucose is further broken down to form the pyruvate. What is pyruvate? It is a 3 carbon molecule, right? So I was explaining you this part. So there are 3 different pathways here. The first pathway is what happens to the glucose which entered, that is the pyruvate which entered in mitochondria. This takes place in the presence of oxygen. So as it enters to the mitochondria in the presence of oxygen, there are some byproducts which are released. Means here the pyruvate is broken down to form carbon dioxide along with water and energy. Energy is the major product which is released in mitochondria. Okay, the energy which is released here is being utilized by our body cells to perform various activities. Okay, so now what are the products which are being released in mitochondria? Carbon dioxide, water and energy. So now in case of yeast, so now I am moving to this part. Okay, so in case of yeast, then first of all tell me what is yeast. Yeast is a unicellular fungi. Okay, yeast is a unicellular fungi. Now in case of fungi, as soon as the glucose enters, do remember the first step is same here also. Means whatever I have taught you here in this step, glucose broken down into pyruvate and then to mitochondria, this step is same here also. Here the glucose is getting broken down again to form pyruvate And later what happens inside the yeast? The first step is same as I told you. But in the yeast, the respiration takes place in the absence of oxygen. In the yeast, the respiration takes place in the absence of oxygen, and we call this process as fermentation. I repeat, we call this process as fermentation. It is a special case actually. So here in the yeast, the pyruvate get broken down into ethanol, carbon dioxide and energy. What happened in the case of yeast? The pyruvate which enters into the yeast in the absence of oxygen, it is broken down to form ethanol, carbon dioxide and energy. Here ethanol is 2 carbon molecule. Why I am telling you? Because here incomplete oxidation takes place. Why? Because it is happening in the absence of oxygen. Whereas here carbon dioxide is released and energy is released, and here complete oxidation took place in the mitochondria, but in the yeast incomplete oxidation takes place. So as a result, what are the byproducts formed? Ethanol, carbon dioxide and energy is released, and it happens in the absence of oxygen. Okay, so hope you understood what is the difference between the breaking down of pyruvate in the presence of oxygen and in the absence of oxygen. Okay, and one more thing you have to remember, I told you here in the presence of oxygen complete oxidation takes place, and in the absence of oxygen incomplete oxidation takes place. And energy released also, here the energy released is very less. Here in mitochondria huge amount of energy is released. Okay, so now moving to the last part of this, what happens in the lack of oxygen? Sometimes, so when we are doing exercises, there will be lack of oxygen in our body. So why? Why when we are doing exercise, there will be lack of oxygen? Because when we doing oxygen, we cannot breathe completely. Means the breathing process does not takes place as we breathe usually. Right? So when we take oxygen in, it has to enter actually to the cells. So to enter to the cells, I mean the oxygen which has to enter to the cells, it takes some time. So this happens usually in our muscles. Okay, what happens is when we are doing exercise, the oxygen which we inhale takes some time to enter to muscles. Okay, so as we breathe, in a normal case what happen? Oxygen enter to the cells, right? So to enter this oxygen to the cells, what happen? There is some time. So during the time, at the time of exercises, what happens usually is in our muscles, the oxygen cannot be received properly by the cells. So as a result of this, what happened? The complete breakdown does not take place. Means the whatever the oxygen which has to be received to the cells, as it is not receiving, what happened? This glucose, which is broken down into pyruvate. Okay, so here complete oxidation does not take place. Why? Because there is lack of oxygen. Oxygen which has been inhaled is not being supplied to the cells properly. As a result, what happened? The cells release the lactic acid. The cells release the lactic acid here, where the lack of oxygen, cells release the lactic acid. Where does this lactic acid is been released? It is released in the muscles. Okay, so as a result, what happened? Complete breakdown does not takes place, and the cells release lactic acid and energy under the lack of oxygen. So I'll tell you once again. So what happens in the lack of oxygen here is the glucose which got broken down into pyruvate enters into the muscles. Okay, so as there is lack of oxygen, the lactic acid is released along with energy. Okay, you might have felt sometimes there will be a what is that sudden muscle cramps, or you'll be noticing that there will be sudden pain in your muscles when you start exercising. So why it is happening? Because when you take in oxygen, that oxygen which has to reach to the muscles needs some time, right? So within this gap, what happened, there will be breaking down of whatever the pyruvate. Okay, so the pyruvate which broken down in the lack of oxygen, it releases the lactic acid and energy. Okay, so this part is very important. I mean the pathway of breaking down of glucose into pyruvate, and what are the products we receive in the absence of oxygen, in the lack of oxygen, and in the presence of oxygen. This is very important because it is compulsorily asked in your examination. Any one of the question is been asked from this part. Okay, usually what kind of question they may ask is, what are the byproducts of respiration, they may ask. So what are the byproducts of respiration in the presence of oxygen? They may ask, what is the byproduct? Carbon dioxide, water and energy. What are the byproducts in the absence of oxygen? Ethanol, carbon dioxide and energy. And in the lack of oxygen, lactic acid and energy. Right? So now this lactic acid which is being produced, it get dissolved in the blood. And I was also telling you about the fermentation, right? So what is another there is another benefit of fermentation. You might have seen that the bakers add yeast to their products, right? Why do they add their yeast? Why do they add the yeast to their products? Why? Because so as they add the yeast, the food get fermented. It undergoes fermentation. So as fermentation takes place, what happens? The carbon dioxide is released. As a result, the cakes becomes spongy or fluffy. You might have seen the cakes or the bread which you have been bought from the bakeries. It is very spongy and fluffy. It is because the bakers, they have added the yeast when they are preparing the dough. Dough means what we call it as in Canada, hittu, right? Whatever that is being prepared, during that time they add the yeast. So as a result of that, fermentation took place and the product became fluffy and spongy. Now I hope you all have understood the concept, right? So where does cellular respiration takes place? Cellular respiration means the respiration which takes place in the presence of oxygen. Where it takes place? In mitochondria. They may ask you like this. And they may also ask you, where does the anaerobic respiration takes place? It takes place in the yeast, you can tell. Right? What is yeast? I told it is a unicellular fungi. And what are the products which are being released under anaerobic respiration? They may ask you absence of oxygen or anaerobic respiration. Both are same. Okay. So the ethanol, carbon dioxide and energy is released. Okay. So like this you will get lot of questions from this part. So please remember, students. So I have also given here whatever I have taught you. So byproducts released under anaerobic respiration are carbon dioxide, water and energy. Where does it take place? In mitochondria, in the presence of oxygen. So what are the byproducts of anaerobic respiration? Where does it take place? It takes place in the yeast, in the absence of oxygen. Byproducts are ethanol, carbon dioxide and energy. And in the lack of oxygen in the muscles, what are the byproducts released? Lactic acid and energy. What is the benefit of fermentation? I told you, right? Okay. So hope you have understood. Please recall these points once again. If anyone did not understand the pathway of the breaking down of glucose into pyruvate, please tell me. I'll make as simplified as I can in my another video and I will explain you. So in my next session, we will be continuing with respiration only. In my next session, I will be explaining you How does the respiration takes place in various organisms? Various organisms means it may be human beings, fishes, or frogs, or whatever it may be, various organisms. And which are the organs involved in the respiration? These things we are going to discuss in my next session. Okay, thank you.